turns a certain age, we often measure their life against expectations, what they've accomplished, what they've lost, and where the road they chose has actually taken them. But when the man in question is Serafin Zambada Ortiz, the son of one of the most powerful and feared drug lords in the history of the Western Hemisphere, that question carries a very different kind of weight, because here is a man who grew up with everything that cartel royalty could offer: the money, the protection, the power, and the name. A name that for decades made governments shake and made entire armies look the other way. And yet, here he is. And the life he is living right now, on the other side of all of that, is something no one is really talking about. El Mayo's Narco son just turned another year older, and I assure you, the real story lies in the details that the media conveniently avoids. Because this isn't just a story about one man's birthday. This is a story about what happens when you are born into the belly of the most sophisticated criminal empire the world has ever seen. When your last name is both a crown and a target, and when every single decision your family makes, even the ones made thousands of miles away, even the ones made in courtrooms you've never set foot in, has the power to change your life overnight. So stay with me, cuz what I'm about to walk you through is the kind of rise and consequence story that sounds like it was written in Hollywood, except every single part of it actually happened. But amidst everything you think you already know about the Sinaloa cartel, the Netflix dramatizations, the El Chapo headlines, the prison escapes through tunnels, I assure you the real story lies in the quieter details the cameras never caught. Because the man who actually built the machine wasn't the one wearing the spotlight, and his son's story can't be told without understanding that difference first. But before we get into where Serafin is now, and what his life looks like today, I need you to first understand who his father really was, and what it actually meant to be born into the Zambada dynasty. 'Cause without that foundation, none of the rest of this makes sense. Ismael Mario Zambada Garca was born on January the 1st, 1948, in a small rural community near Culiacan, in the western Mexican state of Sinaloa. He grew up poor. Not Hollywood poor, not dramatized poor, actually poor. In the dirt and heat, 6th grade education and out kind of way. He left school early, went to work in the fields, and at some point during his teenage years, he made a decision that would define not just his life, but the lives of everyone who would ever carry his blood. According to his own words, spoken decades later in a Brooklyn federal courtroom, Zambada Garca began planting marijuana when he was around 19 or 20 years old. That was 1969. And from that single quiet moment in a dusty Sinaloa field, one of the most consequential criminal careers in recorded history began to grow. Now here's where things get interesting. Because El Mayo wasn't like the other cartel bosses who would eventually share his world. He wasn't theatrical. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't the guy who built zoos with exotic tigers and helicopters for his children. He was quiet, methodical, disciplined. He was the strategist. While El Chapo Guzman became the face that everyone knew, the mugshots, the trial, the Netflix series, the global infamy, El Mayo operated in the background. He was the mind behind the machine, the one handling logistics, cultivating relationships with corrupt officials, paying bribe budgets that reportedly reached $1 million a month to law enforcement and government figures at the highest levels. That wasn't a one-time payoff or an occasional favor. It was, by his own later admission in court, a sustained, decades-long line item in the cartel's operating budget, baked into the cost of doing business in the same way payroll or transportation costs are baked into any other enterprise. Police commanders, military officers, customs officials, sometimes entire regional governments, all of it kept on retainer, year after year, so that when shipments moved or warehouses needed protection, the people whose job it was to stop that from happening simply didn't show up, or showed up late, or showed up and then left. He was the one who kept the lights on when the flashier bosses got arrested or killed. And for more than 5 decades, he did all of this without ever once being placed in a jail cell. To put into context just how unusual that disappearing act actually was, you have to understand what the Sinaloa cartel even was before it had that name. The roots of the entire organization trace back to the 1970s and 80s, when traffickers in Sinaloa operated loosely under a single umbrella, sometimes called the Guadalajara cartel, run by a figure named Miguel Ángel Flix Gallardo, a man often referred to by historians of the drug trade as El Padrino, the Godfather. Flix Gallardo functioned almost like a franchise operator, parceling out territory and smuggling routes to a small circle of trusted lieutenants. Among those lieutenants were a young, ambitious El Chapo Guzman and an even quieter, less visible El Mayo Zambada, who had already spent more than a decade building his own networks in the hills and farmland around Culiacan. When Flix Gallardo was arrested in 1989, his organization splintered along regional lines: the Tijuana cartel, the Jerez cartel, and what would become the Sinaloa cartel, with Guzman and Zambada among its founding co-leaders. It's worth sitting with that detail for a second. By the time most of the world had even heard the term cartel, El Mayo had already been moving product for 2 decades and helping decide how an entire criminal underworld would be divided. Think about that. El Chapo was arrested twice in Mexico, escaped twice, got extradited, got convicted. Other cartel leaders got killed in firefights or betrayed by their own people. El Mayo just kept operating. He once told a journalist in a rare 2010 interview with the Mexican magazine Proceso that he was terrified of being incarcerated, that he would sooner die than go to prison, and for 55 years, it looked like he might actually manage to live by that code. But we'll get back to what eventually happened to him, 'cause it's directly connected to everything that's happening to his son right now. And here's where the dynamic between the two founders matters for understanding everything that came after. El Chapo and El Mayo were never quite equals in temperament, even though they were equals on paper. El Chapo wanted territory, wanted the title, wanted the violence to make a statement. El Mayo wanted the supply chains to keep moving and the bribes to keep landing in the right hands. Analysts who've studied the cartel's internal structure over the decades have described the relationship less as a partnership of friends and more as a long, mutually beneficial truce between two very different operating philosophies. One loud, one silent, both extraordinarily effective in their own register. That difference is part of why El Mayo outlasted everyone. When El Chapo escaped from Altiplano prison through a mile-long tunnel in 2015, an operation so audacious it became a global news story for weeks, El Mayo's reaction, according to people close to the organization at the time, was reportedly closer to quiet exasperation than celebration. Every headline El Chapo generated was, from El Mayo's perspective, another flashlight pointed at an operation that functioned best in the dark. And when El Chapo was finally extradited for good in 2017, El Mayo didn't mourn the loss of a partner so much as inherit, fully and finally, the kind of operational control he'd quietly held for years anyway. So into this world of power, of shadow, of carefully maintained silence and extraordinary violence, a child was born. Serafin Zambada Ortiz, known by the nickname Sarah, came into this world on May 27, 1990. And here's a detail that a lot of people overlook. He wasn't born in Mexico. He was born in San Diego, California, in the United States of America. That birthplace made him an American citizen by right, a legal fact that would play a significant role in how his life unfolded and how the legal system would eventually deal with him. His mother was Leticia Ortiz, and he grew up primarily in Sinaloa, in and around the city of Culiacan, the capital of the state and the historic stronghold of the cartel his father helped build. But he also spent time in Phoenix, Arizona, and according to prosecutors, he attended high school there. So from the very beginning, Serafin Zambada Ortiz was a man who lived between two worlds: American citizen, Mexican cartel son, raised under the shadow of one of the most wanted men on the planet. Now listen closely, 'cause what I'm going to say next brings everything together. Growing up as the son of El Mayo wasn't what you might picture it to be. El Mayo wasn't the kind of father who showed up in music videos or had his face on murals in every town. He was careful. He was invisible. There were no publicly known photographs of El Mayo for most of his criminal career. He didn't give interviews, didn't attend flashy parties, didn't want to be seen. His entire operational philosophy was built on silence and invisibility. And he raised his family under that same philosophy, at least he tried to. Because the problem with raising children inside a world of unlimited money, unlimited power, and unlimited privilege is that the children don't always adopt the discipline that kept their father alive. And Serafin, in that sense, was the opposite of his father in the most dangerous possible way. As a young man, Serafin Zambada Ortiz embraced a lifestyle that was everything his father was not. Where El Mayo avoided attention, Sera seemed to court it. He became active on social media, at a time when social media was still a relatively new phenomenon, and what he posted on his accounts was, to put it simply, jaw-dropping. We're talking about images of gold-plated AK-47s leaning against expensive furniture, exotic animals, including what appeared to be a pet cheetah, lounging in private compounds, stacks of cash, bags of marijuana displayed like trophies, $200,000 Bentley automobiles, private parties, and luxury goods that most people will never see in their lifetimes. The captions were careless, almost defiant. Partying as always, taking care of us? Read one post alongside images of high-powered rifles. He had followers numbering in the tens of thousands, and his social media circle included Alfredo Guzman, one of the sons of El Chapo himself. Cartel royalty, socializing openly on the public internet. And here's something worth understanding about that period specifically. Because Serafin wasn't actually unique in doing this, he was part of a phenomenon. Around the same years, a wave of young men connected to Mexico's cartels began cultivating public personas online that journalists and researchers eventually nicknamed the Narco Juniors. Sons and nephews of cartel figures posting designer clothing, weapons, luxury cars, and tigers as house pets, building followings in the tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands. Some of it was genuine bravado. Some of it, according to analysts who studied the trend, functioned as a kind of recruitment advertising, a way of broadcasting the lifestyle on offer to young men in cartel-controlled towns who had few other paths to that kind of wealth. Whatever the motive, it created an entirely new kind of intelligence trail. Law enforcement on both sides of the border started treating these accounts less like gossip fodder and more like investigative leads, geotags, vehicle plates, faces in the background of party photos. All of it became raw material for building cases. Serafin's own half-brother, Ismael Zambada Imperial, was reportedly tracked in part through his social media activity before his 2014 arrest. The generation that grew up believing the internet was just another flex turned out to be handing prosecutors a paper trail their fathers had spent entire careers avoiding. Now, to put into context just how reckless this was, His father had spent decades as one of the most wanted men in the world, precisely by never being seen. He had evaded Mexican federal police, the FBI, the CIA, military raids, and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of enforcement resources, all because he understood that invisibility was his greatest weapon. And his son was out here posting lifestyle content to thousands of followers. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. But here's the thing, and this is something no one actually talks about. That behavior wasn't just recklessness. It was a product of environment. When you grow up inside an organization as powerful as the Sinaloa cartel was in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the sense of untouchability isn't just a feeling. It's been earned. It's been reinforced by reality, year after year. Cops who look the other way. Government officials who take the money and ask no questions. Raids that mysteriously miss their targets. If you were Serafin Zambada Ortiz, born into that world, raised in that world, watching your father operate for decades without a single arrest, why would you ever believe that anything could actually touch you? He was also an agronomy student at the Autonomous University of Sinaloa in Culiacan at one point, which tells you something about the dual nature of his upbringing. There was an attempt, at least on the surface, at a normal civilian life. He enrolled in university, he was studying agriculture, the same land and crops that had been central to the cartel's business going back to his grandfather's generation. But that normal life was always running parallel to a much darker reality. And then there was his marriage. Serafin married Karime Torres Acosta on February 6, 2006. He was 15 years old. Different reports describe his wife's father differently. Some name him as Manuel Torres Flix, others as Javier Torres Flix. But they agree on the nickname, El Ondado, the Crazy One, and on the fact that he was a powerful Sinaloa cartel lieutenant. Think about what this marriage means in cartel terms. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a dynastic alliance. Two of the most powerful criminal families in Mexico, formally linking themselves through their children. Serafin was the son of the man who ran the cartel. His wife was the daughter of one of the cartel's most feared commanders. And significantly, her father was killed in a gunfight with the Mexican army in October 2013, just weeks before Serafin himself would have his life changed forever. November 20th, 2013. That is the date everything changes. It's the date that marks the end of Serafin Zambada Ortiz's life as he had been living it, and the beginning of a very different kind of existence. On that Wednesday afternoon, Serafin and his wife Karime attempted to cross the international border from Mexico into the United States on foot at the Nogales, Arizona, port of entry. The stated reason for the crossing varies depending on the source. Some accounts describe a trip to handle his wife's immigration paperwork. Others describe it simply as a Christmas shopping trip. Either way, it was deliberately, almost absurdly ordinary. They were walking through a pedestrian crossing lane. Karime was released. Serafin was not. Federal agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration were waiting. An indictment had been filed under seal in San Diego on September 27, 2013, nearly 2 months earlier. That indictment, which had been kept deliberately secret, alleged that Serafin Zambada Ortiz had conspired to import cocaine and methamphetamine into the United States. The case had been quietly built. And when the moment came to spring it, they got him in the most ordinary possible setting. A 23-year-old walking across a pedestrian bridge with his wife. He was sent initially to a federal detention facility in Tucson, Arizona, where he made his first appearance before U.S. District Judge D. Thomas Ferraro, who ordered him transferred to San Diego to face the charges there as soon as practical. And almost immediately, the case entered a zone of deep secrecy, that very few high-profile criminal matters achieve. Most details about the proceedings were shielded from public view. His lawyers operated behind closed doors. Transfers between facilities were tracked down by journalists, and at one point in early 2015, sources leaked that he was no longer at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in San Diego, where he had been registered, though he wasn't officially registered anywhere else either. He had, in the language of the federal prison system, essentially disappeared from public record for a period. That kind of secrecy is a signal. It suggests that whatever was happening in those proceedings was considered sensitive enough at the highest levels of law enforcement to warrant extraordinary measures. In September 2014, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges, specifically to conspiring to import more than 100 kilograms of cocaine and 1,000 kilograms of marijuana from Mexico into the United States, with prosecutors alleging the plan was to move the drugs into California for sale. He was 24 years old. Under the terms of the agreement, he also agreed to forfeit $250,000 as proceeds of criminal activity. Now listen, the mandatory minimum sentence for that kind of conviction is 10 years. The maximum is life in prison. Prosecutors had called his guilty plea, in their own words, a step forward in ongoing efforts to dismantle the most powerful crime syndicate in Mexico. They had charged him with being a major player in the cartel, not just a name on a family tree. And yet, the sentence he ultimately received, handed down in March 2018, was 5.5 years. 5.5 years for a man whose father was one of the top 2 cartel leaders in the world, who had admitted to conspiring to flood American streets with cocaine and marijuana on a massive scale. But did any of that controversy stop there? Well, no. Instead, it only made people ask more questions. Law enforcement sources, speaking anonymously, described the outcome as a disgrace. One called it something that made no sense, something that undermined the entire system. The perception, not just in the press, but within law enforcement circles, was that the Zambada family had once again found a way to soften the blow of American justice. El Mayo's relatives had a track record of this. His brother Jess Zambada, alias El Rey, was arrested in Mexico in 2008 and extradited to the United States in 2012 and cooperated with American prosecutors. His older son Vicente, alias El Vicentillo, was arrested in Mexico City in 2009 and extradited to the U.S., where he eventually pleaded guilty, provided testimony against El Chapo at trial, and received a sentence of 15 years. His other son, Ismael Zambada Imperial, alias Mayito Gordo, was arrested in Culiacan in 2014, extradited in 2019, pleaded guilty in 2021, and was sentenced to 9 years. Serafin was the second son to go down. And across all of them, the pattern was consistent: cooperation with U.S. authorities, reduced charges, sentences that legal experts found puzzling given the scale of the alleged crimes. The Zambada family had become almost uniquely skilled at navigating the American legal system in a way that minimized damage. Critics said this wasn't skill. They said it was leverage. Lay the timeline of those arrests side by side and the pattern becomes almost mechanical. El Rey goes down in 2008, gets extradited in 2012, cooperates. Vicente goes down in 2009, gets extradited, eventually testifies at his own father's former partner's trial in 2018 and 2019, walks away with 15 years for a man prosecutors described as a senior cartel operator. Mayito Gordo goes down in 2014, tracked in part, according to investigators at the time, through his own social media activity. The same vulnerability that had already swallowed his half-brother gets extradited in 2019, pleads guilty in 2021, gets 9 years. Serafin goes down in 2013, pleads in 2014, gets 5.5. 4 men, 4 different arrest years, 4 different courtrooms, and in every single case the same basic shape: capture, extradition or transfer, a guilty plea that avoids trial, and a sentence dramatically below what the underlying charges would suggest for an unconnected defendant. If you do the math on that pattern, it stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like a family that had quietly figured out, generation after generation, exactly what currency the American system would accept in exchange for leniency, and exactly how much of that currency each of them was sitting on. And it's worth pausing on Mayito Gordo's case specifically, because it closes a loop that started with Serafin's own arrest. Both half-brothers, born from different mothers but the same father, ended up walking nearly identical paths through nearly identical doors. Culiacan to a Mexican jail cell, to an American courtroom, to a sentence far shorter than the headlines around their arrests would have predicted. When Mayito Gordo was finally released from U.S. custody on supervised release in 2024, it meant that by that point, 3 of El Mayo's sons, Vicente, Mayito Gordo, and Serafin, had each individually gone through the same machine and come out the other side with their lives, if not their freedom, more or less intact. That's not luck repeating itself 3 separate times. That's a family with a playbook. On September 11, 2018, Serafin Zambada Ortiz was released from federal prison. He had served 5.5 years, with credit for time served dating back to his 2013 arrest, meaning the formal sentencing in March of that year was really just paperwork catching up to a clock that had already been running for over 4 years. He was 28 years old. And according to reporting from multiple outlets, including Associated Press and various regional Mexican journalists who covered the cartel beat, he returned to Sinaloa, specifically to Culiacan, the city where he grew up, the city his father's organization had controlled for decades. As a convicted felon and Mexican national, he was processed through standard immigration removal proceedings on his way out, the same bureaucratic pipeline that virtually every deported drug offender goes through, regardless of whose son they happen to be. And according to people who knew him and sources familiar with the situation, he was not known to be involved in the drug trade after his release. Friends and family, when approached by journalists, described him as someone who had taken a step back, someone who was living a quieter life, someone who, unlike his older brothers, was not positioning himself as a cartel operator. But here's where it gets complicated. 'Cause the question of whether Serafin Zambada Ortiz was truly living a quiet life, or whether he simply learned from his father's playbook to be less visible, is one that American prosecutors apparently had views on. The United States government continued to carry additional sealed charges against him, related to methamphetamine trafficking and other narcotics offenses, for which he still faced potential prison time of 1 to 10 years in the U.S. Those charges hadn't gone away simply because he'd served his sentence. The case remained active. The legal exposure remained real. And the truth is, when you are the son of Ismael El Mayo Zambada, when your name is literally Zambada Ortiz, and when you are living in Culiacan while a cartel war between your family's faction and the Chapitos is setting the entire state on fire, the idea that you're simply blending into civilian life strains credibility. At the very least, the pressure around him never stopped. Now let me explain what was happening to the broader world around Serafin during these years, because the context is essential. For the years immediately following his 2018 release, his father El Mayo was still free, still operating, still the supreme leader of the Sinaloa cartel's largest faction. El Chapo had been extradited to the U.S. in 2017, convicted at trial in Brooklyn in February 2019, and sentenced to life in prison at a maximum security facility that he would later describe through his lawyers, as inhumane. This left El Mayo as the undisputed senior figure in the cartel, the last of the original founders, still standing and still free. His son Mayito Flaco, Ismael Zambada Siqueiros, had emerged as a potential heir to the operation. Serafin existed somewhere in this hierarchy, not a visible operator, not a flashy heir, but present. Connected, named, and watched. The years between 2018 and 2024 saw the Sinaloa cartel deal with pressure unlike anything it had faced before. El Chapo's sons, the Chapitos, had taken over their father's faction and were running it with a very different style than their father had. More violent, more reckless, more confrontational. They built out a fentanyl manufacturing operation that put them in the crosshairs of American prosecutors in ways the cartel had never faced before. In April 2023, the U.S. Justice Department announced charges against 28 Sinaloa cartel members, including the Chapitos themselves, in a massive fentanyl trafficking investigation. The drug had become politically toxic in the United States, fueling hundreds of thousands of overdose deaths and creating enormous political pressure for action. And the Sinaloa cartel, for all its history and sophistication, was now publicly identified as the single largest supplier of fentanyl into the American market. Through all of this, El Mayo managed, somehow, to stay free. He was the subject of a multi-million-dollar DIA reward for information leading to his arrest. He had been indicted in multiple federal jurisdictions across the United States. He had been charged with drug trafficking, money laundering, murder conspiracy, and eventually fentanyl manufacturing, in superseding indictments updated year after year. And still, he operated. He had survived attempted assassinations, including an attack allegedly carried out by a rival cartel figure in 2017. He had watched his brother, 2 sons, and a nephew all be captured and processed through the American legal system. And still, he operated. July 25th, 2024. That is the date that changed everything, not just for El Mayo, but for every single member of the Zambada family, including Serafin. On that Thursday, a private plane landed at a small airstrip near the Santa Teresa area on the U.S. side of the New Mexico-Texas border, just outside El Paso. On board were 2 men, Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garca, who had just turned 76 years old, and Joaquin Guzman Elpez, one of the Chapitos, a son of El Chapo. Both men were immediately taken into U.S. custody. El Mayo, who had never spent a single night in a jail cell in more than 5 decades of criminal activity, was under arrest for the first time in his life. The circumstances were immediately explosive. El Mayo's lawyers sent a letter to the press claiming that Joaquin Guzman Elpez had kidnapped El Mayo, had tricked him, lured him to a meeting under false pretenses, and then put him on that plane. The Guzman family denied everything. U.S. authorities stayed largely quiet about the specifics, but what was undeniable was the result. One of the most wanted men in the history of organized crime was now in American federal custody, and the ripple effects were going to be felt by everyone. Within weeks, Sinaloa was at war. The Maisa faction, El Mayo's people, accused the Chapitos of engineering his capture and orchestrating a betrayal. On September 9, 2024, coordinated attacks erupted across Culiacan. According to detailed timelines compiled by analysts since then, Mayito Flaco himself authorized the opening operations, with a senior field commander issuing orders for synchronized strikes across the state. At dawn, a Mexican army convoy ran into armed civilians in La Campia, a Chapito stronghold on the east side of Culiacan, and a firefight broke out that killed an army sergeant within hours of the war's official start. Gunmen set up roadblocks throughout the city, stopped civilian vehicles, checked phones for any contact with rival faction members. Schools closed. Businesses shuttered. The streets emptied. Mexico responded by deploying roughly 14,000 soldiers and Marines into Sinaloa and the surrounding states, one of the largest troop commitments to a single internal security crisis in years. But security analysts who've studied the deployment up close have noted something darker. In a conflict this granular, where soldiers are operating inside neighborhoods controlled block by one faction or another, the military doesn't always look like a peacekeeping force to the people fighting. Sometimes, it looks like a third combatant. Security personnel have been killed in the crossfire throughout the conflict, and analysts describe a grim pattern where additional troops on the ground haven't necessarily meant fewer killings, just more parties involved in them. By October 2025, roughly 13 months into the war, tracking by Mexican outlets put the toll at nearly 2,000 homicides and a comparable number of forced disappearances in Sinaloa alone, with the state of play shifting dramatically. Reporting drawing on sources close to both factions, including a former member of El Mayo's own security detail, suggested that La Mayiza, far from being the weaker side, feared to even declare war in the conflict's early days, had fought its way to controlling somewhere around 90% of the territory once held by the Chapitos. Mayito Flaco, alongside an ally known as Chapo Isidro, was being positioned by these same sources as the likely leader of whatever reorganized cartel structure emerges once the dust settles, assuming it ever fully does. The violence didn't stay contained to Culiac. By the back half of 2025, it had reached Mazatlan, the coastal tourist city nearly 140 miles south of where the war began. Investigative reporting found that Mazatlan recorded 95 homicides between January and September of 2025 alone, a jump of more than 200% over the same period the year before, and a total that on its own exceeded the combined homicide counts of 2022 and 2023. Kidnappings and disappearances rose right alongside it. A war that started as an internal cartel succession dispute in one city had, within a year, reshaped the security landscape of an entire coastline. In August 2025, after spending more than a year in federal detention, El Mayo, now 77, walked into a Brooklyn courtroom in front of U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi and a room crowded with federal agents, and pleaded guilty to racketeering conspiracy and running a continuing criminal enterprise spanning from 1989 to 2024. Speaking through a Spanish-language interpreter, he traced his involvement with drugs all the way back to 1969, when he had first planted marijuana as a teenager. "I recognize the great harm illegal drugs have done to the people of the United States, of Mexico, and elsewhere," he said. "I take responsibility for my role in all of it, and I apologize to everyone who has suffered or been affected by my actions." He acknowledged that people working for him had paid bribes to Mexican police and military officials for decades so the organization could operate freely. He acknowledged overseeing an operation that built relationships with cocaine suppliers in Colombia and moved the drug into Mexico by boat and plane before smuggling it across the border. At least 1.5 million kilograms of cocaine since 1980 by prosecutors' accounting, the overwhelming majority of it destined for the United States. And that in later years, fentanyl had become the centerpiece of the cartel's American distribution strategy. Built in part on precursor chemicals purchased from China. Judge Brian Cogan, the same judge who sentenced El Chapo to life in 2019, told the courtroom he would do the same here. The plea agreement orders forfeiture of $15 billion in assets. Sentencing was scheduled for January 13, 2026. What's striking, and what most coverage of that day buried beneath the bigger headlines, is what El Mayo said next, relayed through his attorney, Frank Perez. He didn't just apologize, he made a direct appeal to the place his family came from. His lawyer told reporters that El Mayo was mindful of the impact of this case on his home state of Sinaloa, and that he called on the people there to remain calm, to exercise restraint, and to avoid violence. Nothing is gained by bloodshed, the statement continued. It only deepens wounds and prolongs suffering. Here was a man who had spent 55 years building an empire soaked in exactly that kind of bloodshed, standing in a Brooklyn courtroom on the day he formally surrendered all of it, asking the war his own capture had ignited to please finally stop. Whether anyone in Sinaloa was listening is a separate question entirely. And through all of this, through his father's arrest, through the cartel war setting Sinaloa on fire, through the most significant dismantling of the Zambada family's power structure in history, Serafin Zambada Ortiz has been living in Sinaloa, believed to be in or around Culiacan. According to reporting from late 2024, he was still residing in the state where his family is from, where the cartel his father built has its roots, and where the streets have been soaked in blood ever since the Chapitos and the Maisa began their war. He attended his father's first court hearing in August 2024, along with his sister Teresa, a public appearance that confirmed he was present, accounted for, and following developments closely. Here's something no one actually talks about when it comes to Serafin's life right now. He is a man who exists in one of the most dangerous zones imaginable, not because of what he is doing, but because of what he represents. The cartel war that is raging through Sinaloa is precisely the kind of conflict in which people with powerful last names become targets without doing anything to earn that status. You carry the name Zambada in Culiacan right now, and you are automatically a piece on a board that neither you nor anyone around you is fully controlling anymore. The Chapitos know who every Zambada is. They know where the family has interests, where family members have been seen, who the key figures are. The precision of violence in that war, the fact that both sides grew up inside the same cartel and know each other's operational structures intimately, means that people in Serafin's position are navigating a genuine, daily security threat. Journalists tracking the conflict have documented a wave of targeted killings of social media famous influencers connected to one faction or another being murdered specifically because of who they were associated with, not because of any operational role. That's the texture of the danger Serafin exists inside, and at the same time, he cannot simply leave. He cannot fly to the United States because he has an American conviction on his record and pending legal exposure from additional charges that were never formally dismissed. He cannot present himself as a powerful cartel figure because the U.S. government is watching the Zambada family with more intensity than at any point in history. He cannot disappear into obscurity the way his father spent decades doing because his name is too prominent and the eyes of both governments are trained on anyone connected to the Zambada network. What you're left with is a man trapped in a very particular kind of limbo, surrounded by the remnants of an empire that is fracturing, in a city at war, with a father who has now formally surrendered to the system he spent his entire life avoiding. The broader question of his role has always been complicated by the secrecy that surrounded his legal case. When he was arrested in 2013, the indictment was filed under seal. When he pleaded guilty in 2014, many details were kept from public view. When he was transferred between facilities in 2015, it became news precisely because no one could confirm where he actually was. That kind of deliberate opacity from prosecutors is usually a signal of either ongoing cooperation or ongoing investigation. Sometimes both. And in the context of a family where multiple members provided various forms of cooperation to U.S. authorities, El Rey testified in El Chapo's trial, El Vicentillo provided years of testimony from a Chicago jail cell, the question of whether Serafin Zambada Ortiz made similar arrangements has never been publicly answered. What is on record is that his 5.5-year sentence has repeatedly been described by people who've studied the case as unusually low for the scale of trafficking activity he admitted to, and that several accounts attribute that outcome specifically to cooperation with U.S. authorities, though the details, like almost everything else in his file, remain sealed. The relatively light sentence he received compared to what the charges theoretically warranted has led many legal analysts and law enforcement observers to speculate that the deal involved something more than a simple guilty plea. And if that's true, if Serafin provided information, cooperation, or intelligence of any kind to American prosecutors, then the implications for his life in Sinaloa are even more significant. In cartel culture, cooperation with American law enforcement is considered the ultimate betrayal. People have been killed for far less. The Chapito's own federal indictment described methods that prosecutors said included torture by electrocution and feeding rivals, dead or alive, to tigers kept on cartel properties. This is the environment in which these men operate, and in that environment, even the suspicion of cooperation with American authorities can be a death sentence. According to multiple sources tracking the family in the years since his release, Serafin's marriage to Karime, the union that once symbolized a formal alliance between two of Sinaloa's most powerful bloodlines, has not been the subject of any confirmed public reporting since her father's death and his own arrest in late 2013. Whether that marriage survived the years that followed, the prison sentence, the deportation, and now the war consuming the state both families came from, is simply not known from anything on the public record. That gap itself says something. A wedding at 15 that once made headlines in the context of cartel dynasty building has, like nearly everything else about Serafin's adult life, disappeared into the same deliberate silence that swallowed his court case. Few sources report anything concrete about his current domestic life at all. Most mention only that he is believed to still be in Sinaloa, still connected to family, still largely out of public view. But even that thin sliver of confirmed information tells you something about the shape of the life he's built since 2018. Small, private, and almost entirely off the record, in sharp contrast to the wide open, tens of thousands of followers' visibility that defined him before his arrest. When leaked photographs surfaced in 2023 showing Serafin at parties and in a commercial airplane, the images were notable precisely because they showed a man who was living, but doing so cautiously. No more gold-plated rifles posted to social media. No more luxury car collections displayed for tens of thousands of followers. No more public defiance of the invisible rules his father had always understood. The boy who once seemed to want the world to see his lifestyle has become a man who understands, finally, the danger of visibility. When you do the math, the transformation is significant. From someone whose social media posts were being cited in news stories across the world at the time of his 2013 arrest, to someone who now moves through the world with as little digital footprint as possible. Researchers who've studied this exact pattern across multiple cooperating Sinaloa-affiliated families note that it tends to repeat itself. A loud, exposed early life followed by a long, deliberately invisible second act. Almost as if the family is trying, a generation later, to retroactively learn the lesson El Mayo lived by from the start. He turned another year older recently, and the life people would expect for the son of Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the man who was, for decades, the most powerful drug trafficker on the planet, bears almost no resemblance to the reality. There are no mansions being photographed. No cartel lieutenants reporting to him. No Dia reward poster with his face on it. No dramatic narco corridos being written in his honor. He is a convicted drug trafficker in his mid-30s, living under the constant pressure of unresolved legal exposure in the United States, in a state that is experiencing one of the bloodiest cartel wars in its history. With his father having pleaded guilty in a Brooklyn courtroom and facing a formal sentence of life in prison, his brother Vicente is somewhere in the American witness protection system. His brother Mayo Gordo was released from prison in the U.S. in mid-2024 under supervised release. His brother Mayo Flaco, Ismael Zambada Siqueiros, is currently believed, according to multiple sources tracking the war, to be the most powerful remaining figure connected to the Zambada name, having led La Maiza to what looks, as of the most recent reporting, like the upper hand in the fight for what's left of the cartel's territory. And Serafin exists somewhere in this landscape, watching a dynasty collapse and reconfigure in real time. Simultaneously, the question that hangs over everything, and this is the only question left to answer right now, is whether Serafin Zambada Ortiz will follow the path of his brothers who cooperated and built new identities in the shadows of the American legal system, or whether he will find a way to survive the war that has consumed the place he grew up in. Because Sinaloa is not done with this family. The war between La Maiza and the Chapitos shows no sign of ending cleanly, even with one side now reportedly dominant. There have been rumors, reported by analysts following the conflict, of a possible alliance forming between a weakened Chapitos faction and an outside cartel as a last resort to avoid total defeat. A sign that even a winning side in a war like this doesn't get a clean, final victory. Just a different and possibly longer fight. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, men like Serafin exist, defined by their bloodline, constrained by their legal history, and surrounded by a level of danger that most people cannot conceive of. Other countries and criminal justice systems have taken notice of how the United States has handled the Zambada family. The pattern of relatively reduced sentences for cooperation, the sealed proceedings, the quiet transfers. Analysts have debated whether these outcomes represent the American system working as it should, extracting maximum intelligence from high-value targets in exchange for legal concessions, or whether they represent something more troubling, an elite family using wealth, connections, and savvy lawyers to bend a system that shows no such flexibility to lower-level defendants. But even if you believe the system worked exactly as intended, even if every deal the Zambada sons made was a fair exchange for the intelligence it produced, what you still can't export, what can't be replicated by other criminal families looking at this playbook, is the specific combination of leverage, timing, and information that made those outcomes possible. If other cartel families try to copy what the Zambadas did, walking into American custody and trading testimony for shortened sentences, they're more likely to replicate only the most visible and superficial parts of it, and not the actual conditions that made it work. And those conditions are worth breaking down, because there are at least 3 or 4 specific factors that made the Zambada family's experience genuinely singular. First, there's the matter of scale and timing. El Mayo wasn't just another regional trafficker. For the back half of his career he was, alongside El Chapo, one of the 2 co-founders of literally the largest drug trafficking organization on the planet. The intelligence value of anything his sons or brother could offer prosecutors wasn't comparable to what a mid-level operator from a smaller, regional outfit could trade. You can't manufacture that kind of leverage by simply deciding to cooperate. You need to actually have decades of organizational knowledge sitting inside your head, which most people connected to most cartels simply don't have. Second, there's the matter of having survived long enough to even get there. El Mayo ran his operation for 55 years without an arrest. That kind of longevity created generational depth. Sons, brothers, nephews, all of whom grew up inside the operation and absorbed institutional knowledge over decades rather than years. Most cartel leaders don't last that long. Most get killed, get arrested young, or get sidelined by their own organizations long before their children are old enough to have absorbed that much insider knowledge to trade. Third, there's the legal infrastructure itself. Experienced, well-resourced American defense attorneys who specialize in exactly this kind of negotiation, paid for with cartel money that most defendants facing similar charges simply don't have access to. That isn't a secret weapon other families can't theoretically buy, but it requires liquidity at a scale that very few criminal organizations, even large ones, can sustain after their leadership starts falling. And fourth, and this is the part that's genuinely impossible to replicate going forward, the conditions that allowed this to work have already been used up. El Mayo himself is now in the system. The leverage that came from him being free, operational, and uncharged is gone. Any future Sinaloa figure looking at the Zambada family's outcomes as a model is looking at a closed door, the specific configuration of free patriarch, multiple captured relatives each trading testimony, ongoing operational relevance cannot exist again in quite the same way, because the patriarch himself has now pleaded guilty, and the empire he ran no longer functions as a single coherent entity that anyone has fresh, valuable knowledge about. There's a fifth factor too. One that's less about the Zambadas specifically, and more about the political moment they happen to be processed in. The fentanyl crisis changed the calculation American prosecutors are making with every cartel-linked defendant who comes through the system now. Overdose deaths tied to synthetic opioids climbed into the hundreds of thousands over the past decade, and that death toll has rewritten the politics around cartel prosecutions at every level of the Justice Department. Attorneys general standing at podiums now use words like foreign terrorist organization to describe the Sinaloa cartel, language that didn't exist in earlier eras of drug war prosecution, when even a cartel co-founder's case could move through the system more quietly. The Zambada sons largely cut their deals before that political shift fully took hold. A defendant with their same family ties, the same charges, the same offer to cooperate, arrested today instead of a decade ago, would be negotiating with prosecutors operating under enormous public pressure to look tough rather than efficient. The administration currently in office has made dismantling these organizations a stated priority, with Mexico extraditing dozens of top cartel figures to the U.S. in coordinated waves rather than the slow, case-by-case extraditions of the 2010s. Timing, in other words, wasn't just lucky for the Zambada brothers. It was load-bearing. The version of the American legal system that processed them in 2014 and 2018 simply doesn't exist in the same form anymore, and won't be available to whoever tries to walk through that door next. The empire is over. That is the reality that Serafin has to live with on every birthday that passes. His father, who spent 55 years as one of the most powerful men in the criminal world, who never spent a night in a jail cell until he was well into his 70s, who once said he was so terrified of prison he would rather die than be captured, that man is now exactly where he feared most. He is in a federal institution in the United States. He has pleaded guilty. He has said he is sorry in a federal courtroom in Brooklyn, with the U.S. Attorney General standing feet away telling reporters he will die in that prison, where in her words, he belongs. He is facing a mandatory life sentence and the forfeiture of $15 billion. The man who once paid $1 million a month in bribes just to operate freely, the man who built the world's most sophisticated drug trafficking operation from a 6th grade education and a marijuana field in 1969, is now waiting on a sentencing date like any other defendant. And his son Seraphin turns another year older, with the weight of that reality on every single day. There is a particular kind of sadness in what this life has become. Not sadness for the crimes that were committed. Those were choices with victims, and those victims deserve to be remembered. But sadness in the sense that this story illustrates something worth understanding. That no amount of power, no cartel empire, no dynasty, built on fear and corruption and billions of dollars, ultimately protects the people inside it. Every son of El Mayo who touched the American legal system eventually found himself in a courtroom. Every brother, every uncle, every person who thought the Zambada name was armor discovered at some point that it was also a target. And Seraphin, who has now lived through an arrest, a prison sentence, a release, a cartel war, his father's capture and guilty plea, and the complete dismantling of the world he was born into, is still standing in Culiacan, still carrying that name, still navigating a reality that most people will never fully see from the outside. He just turned another year older. And the life he is living now, in the middle of all of this, is something far sadder than anything his father's enemies ever managed to inflict on the Zambada family. Because the real damage wasn't done by the DEA or the FBI or the federal courts. The real damage was done slowly, over years and decades, by the choices made inside this family long before Seraphin was even old enough to understand what any of it meant. He was born into a war, and the war is not over.